get my 6. Happy October. Did y'all hear the news that they actually tried to stop Halloween? The authorities tried to cancel Halloween. They'd have had their way too if it weren't for a couple of quick thinking pioneers here in these very Blue Ridge Mountains going back a long time ago who staved off the authorities and their wicked ways through the creation of the Jack and the Jill corns. So yes, this, our most favorite time of year in which we celebrate our most favorite holiday, almost got snuffed in the bud before it ever got a good, healthy fire lit under it. I'm going to tell you about that time right now for those of you who haven't heard of it. That situation that nearly cost us this great holiday before we ever got to celebrate it. A reading from October Nights Part 2, 31 more tales for the Halloween season. Being that it's October 1st, that's where we're starting. A story called You Cannot Stop Halloween, which also explains to us the origin of the Jack and the Jill corn. If you're asking which one is which, how can you tell them apart? Well, the answer lies here in the story. You continue to watch behind me as the veil is growing very thin this time of year. See what may or may not show up to hear this tale. It was the 1690s, and it all happened in a little Blue Ridge mountaintop village, now part of the beautiful state of Virginia. But what was back then merely a colony? Small pockets of people existed all over, hidden in the forests of a still unsettled nation, and they were hiding from the tyrannical Church of England. History looks back on these times as the Puritan age, and many of the folks who lived during said times would have called it all a living hell, hence their desire to escape and hide. Too many people had seen their mothers, wives, and sisters burned at the stake due to someone else's accusation that they were a witch. Many men were drawn and quartered for heresy or for having been found playing cards, discussing political matters, or drinking a beer on a Sunday. Many of the folks who lived in these hidden communities were first-generation immigrants who'd come to a soon-to-be great nation, well, if you consider it almost a century's worth of waiting, soon, to get away from the tyrannical rule of religion, only to find that they were expected to live under the same constraints in the New World. And many of them said, "The heck we will," and hence the small Blue Ridge mountaintop community which sits at the center of our story, and many other communities just like it, up and down what is now the east coast of the United States. At the time of the events centered in our story, the town did not have a name, for you see, if it were to have a name, it would have been easier to locate. People talk, and they talked even then, and though word of mouth spread much more slowly back then, as many people would go literally for years without venturing out of their small communities, mostly for safety, because back in those days, one was still liable to get scalped by any number of natives if traveling too far away from the safety of said communities, and in small numbers, but alas, word of mouth still spread. The name of the community today would not be known, as the community, long ago abandoned, has been entirely reclaimed by the forest which surrounded it. Few relics, if any, remain, artifacts which would allow archaeologists to give us more of an historic account of the goings-on of this community. However, it is not the name of the village which is important, nor are any old busted-up clay pots or iron fire pokers as important as the community's biggest contributions to history, the continuation of the age-old tradition and celebration of Halloween, and the emergence of what would come to be known as Jack and Jill corns. Historic events that would prove once and for all to the Church of England and everyone else who would try to stop it that you cannot stop Halloween. You see, despite the slow spreading of information by way of word of mouth mentioned earlier, in time the Church of England and its representatives did hear about this community. And they did send one of their most strict, Bible-beating tyrants of a preacher out to find said community and make sure all the living members of the community were living within the strict, straight lines of Puritanism. This man's name was Pastor Black, and his soul was as dark as his name suggested, but he carried out all his jaded, bitter, deceitful ways in the name of the church. So the church at least loved him, though not a single parishioner that he ever had ever did. Pastor Black happened into the village for the first time at the beginning of one most beautiful October there had ever been. The tulip poplar leaves were yellow and the maples were orange. The oaks were just beginning to turn purple, while the nearly shining, radiant, bright yellow leaves of the hickory trees announced where a hungry man could easily harvest enough squirrels to feed his family for the month, as their nuts were dropping like rain, attracting said squirrels, as were the acorns from the oaks, bringing in deer, bears, and turkeys, and the beech nuts and the walnuts of the neighboring trees were all doing the same. The townspeople had heard the man, Pastor Black, was on his way. They'd built a building of worship when they'd set up their community years before, though they'd never had a bona fide pastor. People in the community used the building as a place of prayer, and if and whenever they wanted. It had been used mostly, however, as a community center where the inhabitants of the small, peaceful, and up until now mostly drama-free populace would meet to celebrate birthdays, holidays, and, well, nothing in particular at times. All parishioners to the house of worship. These were the first words all the villagers heard Pastor Black speak. He said these words to all he encountered as he made his way down the trail that would be considered in today's terminology to be Main Street. He said this going door to door as he knocked on the doors of houses, and he said these words as he went from shop to shop. By the time he'd made his way to the other end of Main Street Trail, he had all 40 or so of the villagers following him. "I am Pastor Black," he announced to the crowd now gathered in the small building once they'd all settled in. "I've been sent by the Church of England to extinguish any and all of your heathen ways." "You got here just in time for the fall festival," one of the villagers said. This was followed by loud, happy murmuring, for you see, the fall festival was the small community's favorite festivity of the year. Sure, they loved Christmas, and as well, but most of the villagers stayed holed up through the brutal mountain winters, and the fall festival was the last opportunity of the year for mass gatherings while still being able to enjoy nice weather. "There will be no fall festival this year," Pastor Black said. This followed by one giant loud gasp of disbelief. "You no doubt celebrate the heathen pagan ritual of Halloween, I take it, at the end of this festival." "Well, yeah, but," one of the villagers began, only to have Pastor Black hold up a hand and cut him off. "There will be no suffering of Yabbit's disease around here." "In my parish," Pastor Black said. The villagers looked around from face to face. Yabbit's disease, they thought. What's that even mean? "But," another villager, a young girl of about 12, began, "that's merely a symptom of the same malady, young lady, so alas, we'll say no buts either. It's what I say that goes around here now, and there will be no witchcraft or devilishness. There will be no Halloween." The villagers continued looking around among themselves, surprised by what they were hearing. How had the church found them? Why had they sent this Bible-beating tyrant just as their small community had gotten nicely established and had already begun to build its own traditions on top of the historic traditions they already celebrated? "To prove I'm not a complete stick in the mud," Pastor Black said, "I will allow for a harvest festival. We will celebrate the bounty provided by our Creator, and you will make sure to keep a strict account of the value of said bounty, and a proper percentage shall go to the church. Through me, of course." "Son of a bitch," Timmy Jaspers whispered from the back of the crowd. Timmy was of age now, 18 years old, and he'd planned on asking the beautiful Miss Sally Sutton, now 18 as well, to marry him at the Halloween dance. With no Halloween, there would be no Halloween dance. With no Halloween dance, there would be no proposal. "He can't stop Halloween," Timmy said, looking over at his best good buddy, Bartholomew Holmes, who everyone called Bart for short. "We ain't going to let this stand," Bart said. Over the course of the month of October, the level of fun in the small mountaintop community dropped by such an astonishing level that it had pretty much vanished. Under the ever watchful and controlling eyes of Pastor Black, it was back to no cards, politics, or beer on Sunday. Women began fearing being accused of witchcraft should another lady of the mountain decide they wanted to take their bow. Men feared speaking their mind as they'd done freely up until the arrival of Pastor Black, for if their mind was not aligned with the mind of the Church of England, why, they might find themselves at the gallows, or worse, being drawn and quartered. Unbeknownst to Pastor Black, and even half of the villagers themselves, the half that could not be trusted, of course, Timmy Jaspers and his buddy Bart had made plans for a secret Halloween party, not to be held within the village limits on Halloween night, but rather 2 miles away where the most beautiful open meadow on the mountain bordered a quick-running mountain stream. The half of the villagers who were invited were told not to take the trek to the location of the party until after darkness had fallen, in order to avoid being seen by those who'd not been invited, and especially by Pastor Black. All went well for the first hour or so of the party. There was mountain music provided by the handful of villagers who could play instruments and who'd brought their instruments with them. There was dancing, there were games, there were freshly baked pies and pumpkin bread and all kinds of other sweet treats, and there was hard cider and beer aplenty. And the best part of the party, at least for Timmy Jaspers, was the part only an hour into the party where he'd asked Miss Sally Sutton to marry him, and she'd said yes. And Timmy Jaspers had stopped the band to make the announcement. And then, "Stop, I say!" an ominous voice shouted, but it wasn't Timmy Jaspers' voice. It was the voice of Pastor Black. It appeared that a few villagers who'd not gotten an invite, upon seeing some of their neighbors heading off for the party, went straight to Pastor Black to inform him of the apparent goings-on. "How dare you go behind my back and celebrate this heathen pagan tradition?" Pastor Black screamed as he made his way to the front of those in attendance. "Are you behind all of this?" he said, looking with piercing eyes at Timmy Jaspers. "It's just a party," Timmy Jaspers said, "and me and Sally Sutton got engaged." The crowd broke into a loud cheer with this news, but Pastor Black screamed again, "Stop! There will be no celebrations of any sort tonight on this pagan day. Everyone return to the village, and we will come clean up and repent for your heathen ways tomorrow, and there will never be another Halloween celebrated within this parish again." The villagers turned, their heads down, and began walking back to the village. "You cannot stop Halloween," several of them murmured. Pastor Black heard this from a couple of the villagers, and he said, "Yeah? Well, I just did. I'm a bit parched, so get my 6 while I quench my thirst." The next year's planting season was one like the villagers had never known. They'd always grown enough of everything they needed to get them through the year, including the often harsh winters, and they'd never grown anything that they hadn't needed. Well, this year, Pastor Black had them doing 2 things quite differently. Number 1, he had them growing a ridiculous amount of tobacco so that he could sell it back in England, all proceeds going to the church, and through him, of course. And secondly, there was to be no pumpkins or gourds planted at all. "How can we have our harvest festival without pumpkins?" one villager had asked. "And what about pumpkin pies and pumpkin bread?" another had asked as well. "Without pumpkins and gourds," Pastor Black had answered, "you cannot have jack-o'-lanterns. And without jack-o'-lanterns, you cannot have Halloween." "You cannot stop Halloween," Timmy Jaspers mumbled upon hearing this. "What was that, Mr. Jaspers?" Pastor Black said. He was looking in Timmy's direction, but he was not looking at Timmy Jaspers. He was looking at the former Miss Sally Sutton, now Sally Jaspers, who was standing beside her husband. She was a beautiful young woman, and Pastor Black was determined to use his clout as the religious leader of the village to have his way with her, all in due time. "Forget about it," Timmy Jaspers said, turning to walk away with the rest of the crowd. Spring planting took place. Summer came and went. Finally, it was fall again. And though the small mountaintop community was being allowed to have their harvest festival, All things Halloween were not to be spoken of. However, Timmy Jaspers and his best good buddy Bart were not to be outdone. This year, they'd made even more secretive plans for a Halloween party. This year, the party was to take place high atop the highest mountain in their area. It would be a nearly 1 hour long hike, and it was a type of hike that was not for the faint of heart, so only those most in love with Halloween would even be willing to go. Everyone in the community had been aware of it, except, of course, Pastor Black, so that no one would feel left out, this in the hopes, of course, of not being ratted out again like the year before. Despite the difficulty of the hike, nearly half of the small village's population made it, and what a time they had. Once again, there was music and dancing, and though there'd been no pumpkins or gourds grown this year, so that there could be no pumpkin bread or pumpkin pies, or even jack-o'-lanterns, there was plenty of apple pie and other sweetbreads and treats, and there were jack corns and Jill corns. Tons of them. It had been the beautiful Miss Sally Jaspers who'd come up with the idea. The week before the secret party, while sitting under the giant oak tree that stood in her yard, an acorn had fallen from the tree and hit her on the head. She'd picked it up, giggling at how she'd flinched when she'd been unexpectedly pegged, and upon looking at the acorn, the idea hit her, just as the nut itself had. Sally decided she would paint little faces on the little acorns, and she would call them jack-corns. But being newly married and deeply in love and realizing they might get lonely, she'd make female versions as well, and they would be called Jill-corns. And she would create as many Jack and Jill corns as she could find acorns, which were plenty, and she would take them to the Halloween party, and that's exactly what she'd done. Everyone loved the little Jack and Jill corns, and this pleased Sally well. She used them as simple little decorations, placing them on the tables. People were giving them to their sweethearts in pairs as gifts. Some of the children were throwing them at each other, all in fun, of course. When Sally was asked how one was to tell the difference between the jack corn and the Jill corn, because they pretty much looked the same, she just giggled and said, "It's easy. The Jill corns are smarter." Everyone loved her answer as much as they loved her and her tiny creations, and as much as they loved Halloween itself. The party was raging and everyone was dancing around the fire in pure delight when all of a sudden, "Stop! Stop this heathenism immediately!" The music stopped, the dancing stopped, and everyone turned to see Pastor Black marching toward them out of the darkness. "You thought I wouldn't find out about this," he screamed. "You people are predictable. You don't even try to hide the fact that you love this wicked night. All I had to do was wait and watch where you'd sneak off to and then follow you, and, well, here I am." Pastor Black ordered everyone off the mountain. They were told to leave their food and treats and that no one would be coming back for them the next day, for everything they were leaving behind was tainted with the evils of All Hallows Eve. The villagers marched back to their village that night, Pastor Black behind them quoting Bible verses the whole way. What the villagers hadn't known was that Pastor Black had also been planning on how to deal with them, discipline-wise, once they got back to the village. "Who is responsible for these?" Pastor Black said, holding up a handful of Jack and Jill corns once they'd reached the village. "I am," Sally Jasper said, her head down in submissive fashion. "Sally, Sally, Sally," Pastor Black said, "I'm so disappointed in you. I'm not surprised, however, considering who you've made a poor decision to wed." "Hey now," Timmy Jasper said, looking at the preacher. "Bite your tongue, young man," Pastor Black said. He stood, tossing the Jack and Jill corns up and down in his hand, thinking he knew exactly how he'd handle this. First, well, you're a widow. First, he would have the tree where the Jack and Jill corns had originated from chopped down so that it could not produce any more acorns, and he'd order all the oaks in the village cut down for the same reason. At the proper time, but very soon, he would explain to the villagers that God had visited him in a dream and demanded that the villagers give their wives to him, Pastor Black, so that they could all be the brides of the church. Yes, he thought, this is exactly how to get Sally, plus a couple of the other mountain women who were pretty easy on the eyes as well. In time, he figured, he'd go after their daughters. "Men," Pastor Black said, fetch your axes and summarily chop down this tree." As it was, they'd all gathered in front of the Jaspers' residence once reaching the village, and they were standing underneath the very tree which had provided the Jack and Jill corns. "This tree shall stand no more, as it is now tainted with the evils of Halloween night. No more acorns, no more." Pastor Black looked at the acorns in his hand and said, "No more, whatever in the name of Jove these things are. No more Halloween." The men, with their heads down, left to get their axes. Only the women and children remained, so it was a surprise to all in attendance when they heard what sounded like a man's voice say, "You cannot stop Halloween." Everyone in attendance, after hearing the voice, was staring, their mouths agape, at someone or something standing directly behind Pastor Black. So he turned around and said, "What did you say?" Not knowing quite who or what he was addressing, but after only a brief moment, he knew it was the giant oak tree he'd ordered to be chopped down. "I said," the tree began, the words coming from a hole that was apparently the tree's mouth. The mouth was sitting just below an old knot that appeared to be its nose, and, well, it had two eyes above that, and they were glaring directly at Pastor Black as the tree finished its statement. "You cannot stop Halloween." At this, all of the women and children in attendance began backing up slowly, not so much because they were scared, though they were, but because they were simply following the directions of the giant tree and now speaking in the now speaking tree. It waved its limbs in a backup fashion, so to say, as this and this, by reaching downward with its long top branches behind Pastor Black's back, so he could not see. Pastor Black, believing he was now dealing directly with the devil and the evils of Halloween, began shouting out every applicable Bible verse he could think of. The tree continued to wave the women and children back, and once the tree had determined that they were at a safe enough distance, it unleashed hell's fury on Pastor Black by way of launching every acorn from every branch of every one of its limbs directly at Pastor Black's face. The sounds of pain and terror emitted by Pastor Black were hard for the villagers to hear, but when they later talk about it and wonder forevermore if it had all really happened the way it appeared to have happened, under the light of the full Halloween moon, they would all agree that, well, he'd brought it on himself. The fury only lasted about a minute. The men were showing up with their axes just as it ended. "What the?" was the common statement made by the men as they walked upon the group of women and children in what appeared to be a mountain of acorns, 10 feet high and 10 feet in diameter, under which now lay buried the carcass of the man who'd formerly been Pastor Black. Oh yes, he was definitely dead. "What in the name of all things holy happened here?" Timmy Jasper asked his beautiful wife. "You'd never believe it," she said. "Try me," Timmy Jasper said. "Yeah," Bart said. "How about you tell us men folk exactly what happened while we all walk back up the mountain and get back to doing what we were doing?" "You mean go back and finish the Halloween party?" half a dozen people asked simultaneously. "Why not?" Bart and a half a dozen other villagers answered in unison. And they did. And as everyone walked past the giant hill of acorns, they took their little Jack and Jill corns out of their pockets and faced them towards the pile, and in mock voices said to the man buried beneath the pile, "We told you so. You cannot stop Halloween." The end. Jack and Jill corns, as well as autographed print copies of the book October Nights 2 and many of my other writings, are available on our Etsy store. The link is in the description box below. You can get the books in print or in Kindle version on Amazon. But if you can't afford a book or simply don't want to buy one, what's most important to me is that you listen to the stories, and you can do that for every single night of this month in October as long as you keep coming back to the channel, Homesteading Off the Grid. Should you do so, see you tomorrow night for the next reading of October Nights, Part 2. See you then. You cannot stop Halloween.